Hey everybody, David Skripka. Stock chart of the day. So what I figured we look at today is the national debt. I think this is really important right now because now with like this whole theme that probably Trump is going to win, the Republicans are going to sweep everything. It's like, people think happy days are here again, at least in the financial markets. We've seen a huge surge. I'll get back to the Dow theory, sell signal at some point because even the Dow transports have had this huge 4-day rally where they're back at their highs now. So, which is kind of why I said it's always hard to know because that Dow theory is not perfect and it can lag, etc. So, but what I want to show you is I still think the number one problem here going forward is look at there's a lot of problems in society today. I don't really talk about them. This is a financial publications, a financial publication. So like, but and I think like there's a lot of issues out there, and I think whatever I'm someone who's not into political correctness, so I'm not into this whole die stuff or whatever transgender and normalizing a lot of this stuff. But anyhow, so that's the good thing is I think the Republicans would get rid of that kind of stuff. But more importantly, from what I do for a living is like uh uh is I do this financial markets. And the number one problem right now going forward, and this is like way worse than when Trump took over, way worse than when Obama took over, etc., is the national debt. That finally we're teetering on kind of the end game for this. It's $35 trillion. It's 122% of GDP. You can see that the actual federal budget, which is deficit budget, is higher than what they're projecting. It's by 1.5 billion. We still have a couple of months left. So they projected it was going to be about 1.9 to 2 billion, or probably end up being about 2.2 billion. GDP is about 27 to 28 billion. So this is going to be 7 to 7.5% of GDP in an economic expansion. By the way, that's part of the reason the economy is expanding, because government spending and deficits in the short term help GDP growth. So, and you can see what's happened over the years. 1960, 15 years after World War II ended, it was 52% of GDP. It was actually fallen. That's one reason the US could have high interest rates in 1980, because it was only 34% of GDP. That's why we can't have double-digit rates again. Now, even if you take the amount of debt that the Fed owns, this is still about 100% of GDP, okay? The Fed probably owns about, 15 to 20% of this debt. And you can see the interest on the debt is now almost 900 billion. That's almost as much as we pay in defense. And of course, Medicaid and Social Security, which, by the way, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security are only going to go higher as the boomers retire, are now nearly 3.2 trillion, right? So that's almost 10% of the national debt, and it's about 15% of GDP. So, and you can see with the actual spending being 7 billion, you cannot cut these two things. So 7 billion, we can see that 4 billion is basically baked in the cake. 4 billion of that 7 billion in federal spending, or over 4 billion, actually, folks, actually 4.1 billion is Social Security, Medicare, interest on the debt, and the deficit's 2 billion. So that essentially, let's look at it this way. If 4 billion of 7 billion is basically baked in the cake, that means you have 3 billion, right? You would have to cut 2 of that 3 billion, and defense is almost a billion. So you basically would have to cut every other federal expenditure outside of defense to balance the budget now, right? And they were going to do it. I think it should do it. Like that's like I keep saying we need a debt crisis to really change things. I know people like to say Trump's an outsider and all that stuff, but he ran out the debt just like every other president, right? What we really need is a debt crisis. You need to be bankrupt like Argentina, and then you get a true outsider, a true guy who's going to cut everything. Like he's cutting ministries, cutting the size of government, cutting everything, Yeah, so that's what you really need. You really need somebody like that who's going to do that, So do that. So anyway, I just wanted to show you this, that this is still a problem. So we're going to look at two things now. We're going to look at how the national debt grew under all these presidents, both Democratic and Republican, and they're both, guilty of this. And then we're going to show you how the debt is, how the debt has grown how the debt, and then what the projections for the debt. So you can see this is going back to Jimmy Carter, Reagan, it exploded. I'll talk about that. Bill Clinton, it went up a little bit. Actually, as a percentage GDP under Clinton, it went down because we had this huge boom in the 90s. And because people were really worried about the debt in the early to mid 90s, government spending did somewhat slow down. And after, the Cold War ended, the military spending kind of slowed and that sort of thing as well. Remember, one reason this debt did ring up under Reagan is he ramped up military spending to help bankrupt the Soviet Union. Then under Bush, it exploded, wars, tax cuts with no corresponding tax cuts. Obama exploded even more. Again, a lot of the bailout spending after the financial crisis to stimulate the economy, thinking that you could borrow at zero forever, etc. Under Trump, it really exploded even more. Remember, Trump was running a huge deficit even before. Now, this, granted, is because of COVID, shutting down the economy, tax revenues collapsing, stimulus checks, etc. And then under Biden, it's exploded even more. And what's insane is that now these were like the two record deficits, back in like 2021. 2021 to 2020, 2021. We're now going back to the 2021 one, when we were still doing emergency COVID spending. And like I've said, it's during an economic expansion. It just tells us how crazy it's gotten, etc. So we can see all the presidents are guilty of it. There's an old saying, the Democrats borrow, or tax and spend, the Republicans borrow and spend. So that's the problem. Like I see Trump talking about getting corporate income taxes down to 15%. I even saw one thing he was throwing around really raising duties and getting rid of the income tax of all at all. That's kind of where the U.S. was pre-World War I. Or, I live in the Bahamas. That's what they do here. There's high duties on everything, but there's no income tax, right? So I actually prefer that kind of system because then, as long as you're keeping duties away from, say, some essentials, food that poor people need, like, I think then I can make my decision. Like if I want to bring in a fancy fridge or a fancy car, duties on cars here are very high. They're 65%. So if I want to bring in a $20,000, semi-used car or used car, yeah, okay, I'll pay $13,000 tax on that, right? But if I'm rich and I want to bring in $100,000 Mercedes, I pay 65 grand, and that's my own choice. So I much more appreciate that sort of taxation. But the problem is, again, you're going to do that. He's not going to cut spending, Okay, that's great. We're going to cut corporate income taxes, but you're not going to cut spending. And this can't go on forever, So, so this is the long-term budget outlook. And you can see World War One went to, I think it actually went to about 120%. But this went all the way down to 23% in 1974. Nixon, I think, actually ran a couple balanced budgets. And then here, you can see in the early 80s, this is what's held by the public, by the way. Again, this is why I'm saying it's closer to 100 now. So the 122 includes stuff that the Fed owns. So this is just the debt held by the public. And the thing about the debt the Fed owns is that interest that they get paid just goes right back to the Treasury. So yeah, it is kind of like the not true amount of debt outstanding, because it's like the government it's a bit of a Ponzi scheme, the government owning its own debt. So you can see here that it was 25% of GDP. Is actually down to 32% as recently as the Clinton era. And then, under Bush, it spiked, and then it really spiked because they had, after the bailouts and whatever. And then you can see it continued to move higher all through the 2000s and spiked again. So we can, like I've said recently, it's about 100%, it says 99% here in 2024. So they're expecting this to go to 166%. Because remember, the next 10 years are huge. Like my dad's a baby boomer. He's 71, and so that, and in your 70s and 80s, that's what most people live into. Everybody, that's that Medicaid and Medicare expense. It's going to explode, right? People are going to start collecting Social Security. Like a lot of people can defer their Social Security or defer some of their pensions, to their late 60s or something. So, but by 2030, every boomer is going to be collecting that stuff. So these are going to continue to explode. And I find the CBO, this is them, the budget office, they're very, very conservative. So we can see by like 2050, we're going to be at 166%. And if you include what the Fed owns, we'll be at like 200% of GDP. Like the only country in the world at 200% right now is Japan, So There's three ways out of this. You're going to default on the debt, which is not going to happen because you're the reserve currency. You're going to see massive government spending cuts like they are doing in Argentina, which is probably not going to happen because the politics of that. Or three, you're going to just see massive money printing and inflation to inflate the debt away. Yeah, you'll get your Social Security, you'll get your pensions, but it ain't going to be worth nothing. And that's what's going to happen. So, of course, I hate to go back to this, being a gold bug, as a lot of people think I am, but that's why, look, that's why I've always wondered why gold isn't higher than it is, because we can all see that the writing is on the wall. Maybe it was suppressed, maybe it was manipulated, but we've broken out to new all-time highs in gold. This nice consolidation happened here. Longer term, gold is moving much, much, much higher. Okay. And because of these debt situations, even though the Europeans have the same kind of problems, Canada, Australia, all the Western world has the same problems, people are going to be less likely to be into the US dollar, or buy US debt, I should say. The US dollar is kind of the least dirty shirt right now. So I've got gold going back 50 years right now. And you can see really gold is in a long-term uptrend, and remember, it was at $35. Actually, let's get it back over 75 years. And yeah, this starts in 70 when gold, basically. So remember, this is $35. You had this first really run here in the 70s from 35 to 800. And then really you could consider this almost a 20-year consolidation where gold went from 800 to 250 at its low. So basically 35 to 800. Let's say we went up $750. We went down 550, that's 50, like a 2/3 retracement. And then we had another huge move to nearly 2000 to 1900 from 250. And then we had like another little consolidation here, from 2000 to 1100. So basically you could say 1900 to 1100. You could basically say we pulled back 800 of this nearly $1,700 move, so say like a 45 to 50% retracement. And now we're moving higher. And if you look at these moves, 250, let's just say this was 2000. Let's say 8x. This is 8x. 35 to over 800. This is 20x. So 8 to 20x from this low here, you're talking basically $10,000 to $20,000 gold ultimately, which makes sense because if anyone knows anything about the Dow to gold ratio, we'll put that on right now, which states that, gold and Dow kind of meet when gold tops. Well, look, the Dow right now is 40,000, right? And you can see they met in 1932 when both were about 35. They met here in 1980 when gold went above 800. And the Dow was about 8 to 900. And you can see it went from 22 to 1 in the early 70s to 1 to 1. And then on this move here, only went to 5 to 6 to 1. That's why I was still long-term bullish gold, because I figure here. So let's look at this realistic. What happens at the markets? Well, if they hyperinflate, the markets, they're going to have some kind of bust first. But I don't know, maybe gold and the Dow meet at 20, 30,000. I don't know, but like that would kind of make sense, right? Something like that, and you can see that historically gold is still very cheap. Like other than the basically the late 90s bubble boom of .com and into like the peak of the markets, here, like we're basically at the highest level of gold, the ratio, whatever, like where we were basically in the early 70s when gold had that huge 20x run. So it's still a long way to go. I know it seems like, okay, gold's breaking out and this and that, but we know from the stocks, we know from the junior companies, we know from the way the equities are acting, how much money you can actually make because the costs are so much higher. Now, when I started out, look, now I sound like, oh, when I was young, I sound like an old man. But like when I started out, I remember when gold went to 500-600 in the 2000s, when I was in my mid to late 20s, I was jumping up and down about 600-700 gold because after years of being around 300, all these gold companies can make a huge amount of money. Like, let me show you one to really show you an example of this, and the stock has come back nicely recently. ELD, sorry. So I'm using the Toronto quote for Eldorado because it didn't trade in the 90s. Yeah. So we're going to go back to, we'll go back 20 years, or we'll go back 30 years on this. So this is Eldorado going back to when it kind of traded. So Eldorado had its huge fine. I remember it collapsed. It's had a reverse split since then, but you can see here. And again, when gold went to like 600-700 by 2006, you can see Eldorado went from just over $1 a share to like $30 a share, right? And was making a huge heaps of money, and eventually went to over $100 a share, And now look at gold is now higher, 20% higher. Gold was like 1900 here, now it's 2400, and Eldorado is like 1/5 of what it was back then. So it just shows you, Eldorado's at the same price it was when gold was 600. And at 600, they were making heaps load of money. Like their cost of production was like at their Kizilleg mine in Turkey was like $200-300 an ounce. And now they need, 2,500, 3,000 gold to make the same amount of money, or probably even higher. So this is just an example. And there's all kinds of companies that look like this. Eldorado is just an example. So that just shows you how inflation has continue to go up, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why gold will go up too, because we still need gold to be produced. And if they do inflate away the currency, well, it means the cost of these gold miners are going to go up too, and they're going to need, higher gold prices to make money. So anyhow, I'm going to leave it at that. I just wanted to show you, look, regardless of what you think of your politics or the whatnot, the fact of the matter is all these politicians spend money. They've all got the debt. People are to blame for that because they want free stuff. They want their government programs, etc. I can't solely, politicians are somewhat of the reflection of the populace. So, but I just wanted to show you this. This is still the number one thing. And again, with that market cap to GDP now being all-time highs, and this is staring you in the face, it's like, I guess your bullish scenario for stocks could be like, I guess this will be the last chart I show here. This is the Argentinian stock market, which went from, like 200-300 to 1.5 million because of hyperinflation. So, but of course, adjusted for US dollars, it hasn't gone up nearly as much as that. But like, as stocks too do act as an inflation hedge, So anyhow, that's basically what you're looking at. But look at before you enter these hyperinflations, you can see Argentina here, like I said. I know it's only like a year or two, but the market fell hard then. It fell 80-90%. There's usually a big bust, which sets the term. Like if we were to go look at, let's go quickly look at Turkey too. DGI, MTR. Actually, let's go TR20. That's the biggest 20 companies. Same kind of thing. Turkey, began this high inflation. And again, these moves don't look like much now, but these moves here, like this down move here or this down move here, they were like 30-40% moves plus the currency collapsing. So they kind of set the tone for this. One reason the Turkey market has gone from 1,000 to 11,000 is because of all the inflation that they've had. So anyhow, so I guess that could be a longer term. The problem with that too is it just destroys your historical, I guess, outlook for, or a way to look back at markets, because all of a sudden the markets go straight up, because of inflation. But, like I don't ever think the US is going to run into that kind of inflation, but what I think they'll do is like inflation will be running at 20-30%. I don't know if the rule 72, but the rule 72 is a compound interest rule. And it basically says that's how long, if you're compounding interest at say 7%, take you about 7 years to double your money. Well, or compounding your returns. So if you're compounding inflation, say at 35%, prices will double over 2 years. That's kind of what I think will happen. They'll underreport it. Maybe they'll say it's like 10-15%. It'll be like 2-3x that. But that's what I think ultimately what will happen. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this. This was an interesting one. I just wanted to show you, whatever. And when I see this euphoria in the markets, and this debt crisis staring us right in the face, I just kind of like to warn people.